All right. Hello, everyone. Let's make sure this is all good to go. All right. Hey, everybody. My name is Ian McLaughlin, and I finished my PhD in neuroscience at the University of Pennsylvania. And here I am in my humble abode on Merry St. Patrick's Day. And as I hope you are as well, I am practicing self-distancing, or shelter at home is one phrase I've heard. It's slightly different, slightly more rigorous. But I thought, it's St. Patrick's Day. Hopefully there are a bunch of other people who are at home who would normally be out, celebrating St. Patrick's Day. And so I figured I would come on here and keep you guys company. It's been a while. Well, I'm glad to see you. Oh, yeah, I forgot. This makes it so much easier for me to see your comments. Do I have debt from Penn? No. So that is something that I think a lot of folks don't... Oh, every time I do that. That a lot of folks don't know about getting a PhD in biomedical science is that when you finish, you don't end up with debt. They actually pay you. It's not a lot, but they pay you, a stipend, and they give you benefits. They cover your health insurance, and it varies place to place. But as opposed to when you go after like an MBA or an MD, as opposed to those graduate degrees, getting a PhD, you actually get paid. So it's just another incentive to go into biomedical science, particularly in these times when we need as much biomedical firepower as we can get. There's one thing that I wanted to talk about before I talk about other stuff, and that is that a friend of mine made a thing online. And I think it's really smart, and particularly now, given that a lot of us are going to be home for a lot longer and maybe won't have access to resources. Or maybe you do have access to resources and you know that other folks within your neighborhood don't. Folks who are, a little bit older or disabled in some way or have kids or something like that keeps them at home. And this is a website that you can go to either volunteer or ask for various kinds of assistance. And so it is called neighborfavor.happytiger.co. Okay? So so you can see it on Twitter there. The initial idea was that it would be for people in Philly. Here we go. Yeah, you can see it now on YouTube. But there's no reason that it is limited to Philly. You can be pretty much anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world, actually, given that this pandemic is not limited to any one country. And as you can see, like some folks have already, my friend made this like today, essentially, or 2 days ago. No, yesterday, I think. And people have already posted. So, for example, offering grocery shopping, meds pickup. Another one is free dog walks for the elderly or immunocompromised. Others have offering nanny recommendations. There's actually 2 of those. And then offering grocery shopping. And you can see where they are. So, for example, you can sort of see in the map there. That's my daughter in the background, by the way. She's wishing you a St. Patrick's Day as well. But you can see in the map those little little spots. That's where people are. So if you are in need of services, or maybe you think you can help out your community, you should check it out. So one more time, it is neighborfavor, one word, .happytiger.co. Check it out. I think it's a really brilliant idea, and I hope I wasn't aware of any similar service. I know people probably are using like Facebook or maybe even Twitter for this kind of thing. But this puts it all in one place, and it's really the idea is people who need things and there's no obvious resource for them to use, they can go here, and so I hope you all will check it out. I think it's a great idea. Okay, Dr. McLaughlin is on. Looks at calendar. It's not Sunday. I know. Yeah. So give us a wave. Hello. My thought was it's St. Patrick's Day. And people, I hope, are practicing some social distancing and not going out to bars, because you really should not. It's rather irresponsible to do that. So like the app Neighborhood, but actually useful. Yeah. So, I also brought up Neighborhood, but there's just not a lot of people who use Neighborhood, and I think not a lot of people know about it. And I looked to see, and it wasn't obvious how you could say, hey, I'll pick up groceries for you, or hey, I will, pick up your medication for you. With the knowledge that we need to practice certain discipline to prevent the spread of the coronavirus. So as our friend here says, hello from quarantined Italy. Yeah, I've read the accounts coming out of Italy, and it's remarkable. I mean, frankly, I think a lot of people in the United States didn't really appreciate the significance of this virus. We sort of read about it, particularly in China. And I think a lot of people in the U.S. didn't really understand until we started seeing some of the stories coming out of Italy that was pretty rapidly overwhelmed and, tragically overwhelmed. I have a friend in France who said much the same, that they are sort of on the precipice of reaching a kind of a similar point in their healthcare system. And in the United States, again, I think a lot of people underestimated what this could result in. And our healthcare system, it's not identical to either France or Italy or really any other country. But it's not all that different either. Right? It's not like we have all these resources that these other countries don't have. And in fact, we probably have lower resources in some cases. Sorry I bother you. Not at all. You don't bother me. Does it mutate? So that's an interesting topic I assume you're referring to the novel coronavirus, which causes COVID-19. This is the disease that we're all very concerned about. So we're still in the period where, and I should say, I have a PhD in neuroscience, so I'm not like an immunologist or a virologist. I've just tried to keep abreast of all the latest research of COVID-19 and this novel coronavirus. So we're still learning about it, right? We're still learning about the basic biology, but we do know quite a bit about the basic biology at an earlier point in the sort of evolution of this virus than we would typically, and that is because the Chinese scientists they sequenced the virus rather rapidly, and then they released the sequence of the virus pretty soon, to the world pretty soon thereafter. And that was remarkably useful because then labs all across the world were able to use those data, and compare it to other viruses, most notably other coronaviruses, and they found that it's genetically really quite similar to the coronavirus that caused the outbreak of SARS in the early 2000s. It's not identical. There are some differences. But because of that, we know quite a bit about how this virus is likely to behave in the human body. And so every virus essentially can mutate, right? That's sort of like how they evolve, is they mutate. It's sort of like this war between the human immune system, or really animal immune systems, and viruses' mutation. And so, for example, the influenza virus evolves rather rapidly, and that's why we always have these new seasons of new strains of the flu, because there are these changes. Now, the coronavirus, clearly it did mutate, right? And part of the reason that we're fairly confident that it originated in probably bats is because bats have, first of all, 1 in 4 mammals on Earth are evidently bats. So bats are a hugely diverse family of mammals. And because of that, and they also, the way they live really like crunched up together, and they're all really close together, and obviously they're not like the most hygienic of mammals. And so as a result, they're sort of like a breeding ground for viruses that could eventually mutate and get the ability to become zoonotic, or meaning that they'll jump to human to humans. Now, so coronaviruses, yes, they can mutate. But the difference, however, is that there are certain genetic elements, and this is where I don't, I'm not entirely fluent in the genetics here, but they have some limiting features that limit their capability to mutate. And so I don't think that biomedical scientists at this point are expecting that this coronavirus will mutate while we're dealing with it. It's possible. And it's also possible that there are some slight differences in their strains. And by the way, I should say that there are some subtle changes that can occur in the sequences that enable a project like NextStrain to sort of follow the trajectory of some of these viruses or this virus. And so we can get really, really close to like pinpointing where this virus originated, where it then moved over time. And so, for example, that's how we know that it's quite likely that a country like Brazil actually had multiple exposures to this novel coronavirus. because you can sort of sequence the differences between two early cases of COVID-19 or infections of this novel coronavirus, and they can tell there's subtle differences that suggest that it wasn't the same introduction, whereas in Washington State in the United States, it seems that the opposite is true, that it was probably one specific introduction that then resulted in, the spreading of the virus. So I know that was like a long story, but it's something I've been thinking about because it's interesting and it's worth keeping in mind, given that we are sort of in the midst of at least in the United States, the sort of the spreading and the increase in numbers of infections. So it's only affecting the countries with socialized medicine. Well, Coors Light, I don't know if you would consider the United States to have socialized medicine. I certainly would not, and it's absolutely affecting the United States. I think now, just in Philadelphia alone, we're up to 18 confirmed cases of coronavirus infections. That's up, I think, 10 from like a day ago or 2 days ago. And I think it's sort of becoming clear that there's probably way more cases of infection with this novel coronavirus than we're even capable of being aware of, because testing wasn't made widespread very early. And so it's just sort of now we're sort of going to get a more accurate picture of how widespread this is. So given that there's more people in here, I wanted to bring up this tool that a friend of mine created, and I think it's pretty brilliant. And so it is called, it is called neighborfavor.happytiger.co. And basically it's a website where you can essentially volunteer for various services for your community. So for example, if you have some elderly folks who live in your community and you think they might need somebody to walk their dogs, as one person has volunteered, or pick up groceries or pick up medications for them, you can do that. And it's sort of, the initial idea was for it being Philly specific, but it can work pretty much anywhere around the world. And so check it out. It's neighborfavor, one word, .happytiger.co. All right, boring. Well, okay, happy St. Patrick's Day to you too. Newton developed calculus and the theory of gravity while in quarantine. What are you going to do? I'm focusing on raising my daughter and just trying to get at least some sleep. Only USA. No, not only USA. I think we tested it out with somebody that we know in Israel, and evidently, it's certainly accessible. And so, I'm sure, there are other platforms. I think Craigslist you could probably use for this, but I think that having this sort of more coherently organized, where it's like specifically what you want to know. I can offer to walk dogs. I can offer to, nanny services or something like that, with the knowledge, with the awareness that we're in the midst of this pandemic. And can you give that address one more time? Sure. It is neighborfavor, one word, sorry, I haven't committed it to memory. She just made this thing. Neighborfavor, one word, .happytiger, one word, .co. So check it out. I think it's a great idea because, we're, different people have sort of different risks in terms of the severity of their infection with this virus. And so, it would be, I think it's just the nice thing to do as a good citizen to help to, offer help to people who are in those positions. Okay. Congrats on your daughter. Just hearing about that. Well, thank you so much, Brandy. Yeah, she is lovely. She just went to sleep. So you would normally have heard her. She has become so vocal, and she knows how to say no now, and she uses it without any kind of reservations, with prejudice. And so today I just started getting her to say yes, which is sort of nice, but I don't think she understands what yes actually means. One of her first words or things that she could say was thank you, but she also doesn't quite understand when you're supposed to say thank you. She'll hand you something and say thank you, which is nice. I prefer that to the alternative. Okay, can spending time in a high heat sauna kill COVID-19? No, at least I've never seen any evidence that it would, and I've seen I think a virus specialist from Minnesota say that's a myth. At least in part because when you're in a sauna, obviously you're exposed to high heat, and the whole concept there is that high heat typically inhibits the spread, and may help to inactivate a virus. But the problem with that concept is that once you're in a sauna, it's true that you're exposed to high heat, but inside of your body, your temperature's still being regulated. So it's not like, let's say you're at 100 degrees in a sauna. It probably goes much higher than that. but the inside of your body is not 100 degrees or 110, 120 degrees. You very rapidly adjust that temperature. And so, yes, so no, that is not like a prophylactic or preventative measure that you should really be focused on. So yeah, really like the best thing is social distancing. That is really like the most effective weapon that we have as a species against a virus like this, for which nobody has any immunization, right? You've never been exposed to it. And it spreads fairly easily. It's a respiratory virus. All you have to do is cough or sneeze. And there's some evidence that it might not even require you to cough or sneeze. They've taken swabs of people's throats who were barely showing any symptoms, really minor symptoms. They didn't really feel like cruddy or anything like that. They didn't feel sick yet, and they detected a ton of viral particles just in their throat. So, it may not be, it may be easier to spread than you might intuitively think. So the best thing to do is just hunker down for a while. Okay. How dangerous is coronavirus for MD patients? Oh, MS patients. That's interesting that you bring that up. So again, I'm not a physician. I have a PhD in neuroscience. But somebody did ask earlier today, are there any studies that evaluate the effect of this novel coronavirus on the brain? And first of all, not really. So, there's just not a lot of, there hasn't been a lot of time for biomedical scientists to really study this thing very much. However, there is a ton of activity going on as we speak. It seems like pretty much every day there's a new study that comes out that characterizes some feature of the virus. And there was a study that came out very recently that did detect, gosh, I wish I had prepared this, some relationship between folks with multiple sclerosis and some difference in the way that that coronaviruses interact with the nervous system. But the reality is, it doesn't have to necessarily, affect your brain. Pretty much people who are immunocompromised, people who have other, biomedical concerns, other ailments, they are at a higher risk in general. And that includes, like, even if you smoke, that ups your risk substantially for, really severe reactions. So yeah, I mean, it is worth it, but you don't have to have any of these maladies to consider this to be a real concern. And it's just a good thing to do as a human being, as a member of the human species, to practice social distancing at this point, and just minimize social distancing. It's not that radical a change in your life. I mean, unless you always hug people when you see them, or you always shake their hand. At least for the time being, just adjust that, augment that behavior, and, try and stay home as much as you can. Okay, my father is tough, but I'm not a virus risk. Good. I have a question, not about the virus. Oh, yeah, of course. I didn't intend for us to only talk about the coronavirus today. I really intended to, say Happy St. Patrick's Day, keep people company who are staying home, doing the responsible thing and staying home and not going out to celebrate. I know, like 2 days ago, in Philly, it was pretty clear that people were not taking this particularly seriously, particularly young people who are, social. And that's a really big problem, because young people are very effective spreaders of any virus, but including this novel coronavirus. First, because you can catch it, and there's evidence that it's still contagious before you present any symptoms. But then also, if you're younger, you're more likely to experience a more mild, constellation of symptoms when you're infected, and therefore you'll probably underestimate how dangerous it is for you to be in the sort of personal space of somebody who's older. And so yeah, that is a very effective strategy for this virus to spread. But now, I live pretty close to like a heavily trafficked area in Philly, typically heavily trafficked, and it's clear that people are taking this more seriously today. Okay. Question. What's the brain science, for lack of a better term, as to how some people are trans? I guess I'm not quite sure what you mean. Gender identity, I suppose, is what you're referring to. Dallas, Texas has reported a middle school kid who tested positive, 2 in their 30s and 40s also. Yeah, and another thing is that there is a widely held belief that this is really only a problem, a threat to people who are elderly, or immunocompromised or have some other malady. But there are certainly cases of people who are younger than 60, younger than 50, who experience very severe illnesses from this coronavirus, and that there can be damage done to the lungs. And so it ought not be. Nobody ought to underestimate how dangerous this coronavirus might be. A question on YouTube. Oh, I should say, so I am 3 subscriptions away on YouTube from being able to just give you my YouTube channel name, as opposed to say, like, search for Ian Brain Anthropoid. So if any of you are predisposed to using YouTube at all, go find my channel, and I would appreciate it if you would subscribe. The difference between what I do on Twitter and what I do on YouTube is that I do both on Sundays, but for the first 15 to 20 minutes, I dive more deeply into a specific topic on YouTube only. And so, for example, I've talked about, some of the recent studies on the coronavirus, this novel coronavirus. For example, there's evidence that a lot of medications that are used to treat other conditions like cancer, pancreatitis, just other broadly speaking conditions that may be helpful in treating people who are exposed to this novel coronavirus. And they're not based on vaccines, because it's going to take a while before there's a vaccine that's available, in the hands of your physician. And that is certainly something that I'm glad to see the FDA is working towards, and CDC. They're expediting that considerably. I think one of the main vaccine candidates is going into phase 1 clinical trial within like 65 days, which is like remarkably fast. So that's compelling. But there are potentially antiviral drugs that could be used to basically interfere with like the fundamental interactions that a viral particle has to have with cells in your body, specifically like your respiratory system. So that's great too. But so I talked about some of that. So anyways, check it out. You can find my channel by searching Ian Anthropoid Brain or something like that. And I would appreciate it. 3 more subscriptions away. So thank you guys. Thank you for humoring me. Yeah, how can we find you on YouTube? Just type in like Ian, I-A-N, Anthropoid, which I know is like certainly one of the easiest words to spell. But you can see it. It's in my handle on Twitter or on Periscope. So Ian Anthropoid Brain or something like that. And then one of my videos will come up, and then I would deeply appreciate your help there. Okay. Don't go out for any useless reason. Please don't let this virus spread. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in a way, it's like one of the most sophisticated viruses out there right now can be defeated by one of the least sophisticated measures, which is just not interacting with people very closely or very frequently. Like, it is fairly simple, but it's kind of difficult to convey the ethical decision that you're making. Let's say you're 21, right? You just got old enough to drink in the United States. And, you feel like, all the stories I'm hearing is that it's only dangerous for elderly people. And so, maybe I'll get it, maybe I'll not. I've had the flu before, But the difference is that may or may not be true, by the way. But the difference is that the ethical decision you're making by going out, if you're young and you feel like the threats don't apply to you very much, is that either you don't care about elderly people that you may or may not interact with, or maybe you don't interact with elderly people very frequently. But the problem is that people with whom you'll interact do. And so, you don't have to spread it directly to an elderly person for an elderly person to be exposed to it through somebody you've interacted with. So it is just the ethical decision making here is very, very clear. Okay, yes, I'm sorry, I skipped the question on YouTube. Hello, any thoughts on autism? I have 3 kiddos out of 4 on the spectrum. That's interesting. Well, so autism is, what we're referring to is autism spectrum disorders, right? And so there are many manifestations of, behaviors that we consider to be autism. And so what we know about autism is that there's a whole constellation of genes that are associated with increasing likelihood of somebody being born with autism or somebody developing autism. And it seems to be the case that you don't need all of these specific genes to develop autism. Rather, it seems like you can have just a selection of that constellation. And then depending upon what your unique constellation is, you may have more, severe case of autism, or you may have, very highly functioning autism. And I can talk a little bit about what a lot of those genes do, but suffice it to say that it would be unsurprising that there is a significant genetic component to autism. If one person in the family has autism, it's likely that more people will have autism as well because of that genetic component. But there also does seem to be an environmental component that is non-trivial. It's not exclusively nature versus nurture. It's almost always both and. All right. You sound and act like you might know what you're talking about. You also have a PhD. That's part of the test. You have to at least sound like you know what you're talking about. I finished my PhD in December in neuroscience, and my research focused on anxiety and addiction. Specifically, a sort of a circuit within the brain, very evolutionarily ancient, meaning that it's been in an animal of some sort on Earth for at least 350 million years. And I can tell you why we know that, but the short story is that we see the same circuit of neurons, the same anatomical region of the brain, in other primates, monkeys, apes, in other mammals, dogs, cats, mice, rats, they have them. But we can even go further down the evolutionary, the phylogenetic tree to animals with whom we're more distantly related, evolutionarily, genetically, all the way to fish. We see it in fish, and that means that fish are pretty far away from us from the phylogenetic tree, and they have it. So this circuit in the brain has been there for a very long time, and we know that it's implicated, at a minimum implicated, in addiction to alcohol, nicotine, opioids, and quite likely also stimulants. But my thesis was, why would there be a circuit in the brain that is involved in the emotional components of withdrawal from these drugs? Why would there be a circuit in the brain that's involved in that, but not involved in regulating mood independently of drug exposure? And that was my dissertation. And, I'll spoiler alert, it seems like it is involved in regulating anxiety. Thank you guys for subscribing to the YouTube channel. So you can find so I am about 3 people away from being able to just say, this is the name of my YouTube channel, so it's easier to find. But if you'd like to find it, or if you're willing to find it and toss me a subscription, I would appreciate it. You just type in Ian, it's my first name, Anthropoid, that is the name that I chose for Twitter before I thought I was actually going to use Twitter very frequently, and then type in brain or neuroscience or something like that. Where did the virus come from? Yeah, that's an interesting question, and we actually have a pretty good idea of where this novel coronavirus came from, and we know that because at a genetic level, so all a virus is, viruses come in different shapes and sizes, and they do slightly different things, but when you boil them down to their bare basics, they are just genetic instructions, very, very simple genetic instructions, just a couple genes. And as a result, we can sequence those genes, just like, you can sequence your genome or your dog's genome. You can sequence a virus. And it turns out that it's very closely related to a old coronavirus that caused an old pandemic or outbreak, I guess, the SARS outbreak. So SARS was caused by a coronavirus. It was about in the early 2000s. And there's pretty good evidence to suggest that it originated in horseshoe bats. In China. And that is perhaps unsurprising because I just read this. I wasn't aware of this until today. Today I learned that about 1 in 4 mammals on Earth is a bat. Isn't that crazy? It's one of the most diverse groups of mammals. And as a result, mammals all have moderately similar immune systems, more similar than other animals. But also bats, the way they live, their habitat is very, very close together. Right? I'm sure you've seen pictures of how bats sleep. They're all crammed together, and they're leaking all kinds of fluids, and they don't present any symptoms when they can be sort of like a reservoir because the virus doesn't kill them, but they can carry it. And of course they interact with the environment, and it seems to be the case that what happened with this coronavirus is what happened with the former coronavirus, which is a bat carrying this virus interact with some other animal that humans in China interact with more closely. So this means that it doesn't have to be the case that somebody ate a bat with this virus or something like that. It could be much more indirect, where this virus then infected a pig, and maybe somebody ate some pork that was carrying, or it wasn't even eaten. It was just they handled the pork. In fact, there is a movie, I think that came out in 2011. And I guess if you're interested in any kind of movies that'll freak you out a little bit more about this virus, is a movie called Contagion. And frankly, I was surprised at how good it was. How like, they did a pretty good job of being pretty accurate about like how the CDC works and how, the CDC and government in the United States would respond to an outbreak. And now I should say that the virus in this movie is significantly more fatal than this novel coronavirus. It's sort of like if Ebola was far more easily to communicate, far more easily to infect other people, to spread. But that said, they sort of, at the very end of the movie, they kind of give you the sort of the story of how this virus spread. And it was basically by some chef handling some infected meat that was infected by a bat, and then goes and shakes the hand of Gwyneth Paltrow, and then the whole world collapses. But, we wouldn't expect something like that to happen with this coronavirus, but it is a very significant, non-trivial concern, as you can see, as sort of like the United States governments, municipal, state, and federal governments are finally sort of starting to exhibit a response that's commensurate with the potential threat of this virus. A lot of people are definitely going to catch this. That at this point, we're beyond that is going to happen. The question is, how quickly are they going to catch it? How quickly can our medical system respond to that? How many of them are in, imperiled demographics, elderly, immunocompromised, have other either lifestyle or medical factors that render them more likely to experience a very severe reaction to this virus. Okay, my meat is infected. Not getting sound. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. I think it would work. This guy is my brother's lover. Well, don't tell my wife or my daughter. Austin, Texas, under the bridge. Yeah, I think that is bat country, right? Okay. I think bats are actually really, really cool. Oh, sweet. So if I'm over 100 subscribers, that means on YouTube, that means the next time I talk to you, I might be able to just say, this is the name of my YouTube channel. And I'm not entirely sure what I'm going to name it. It might just be Anthropoid, just because I have gone with that extraordinarily cumbersome name on everything else. But I appreciate it. And again, on YouTube, what I do is I talk about a specific topic. Most recently, it's been a lot about the coronavirus. A specific paper. I've talked about a bunch of things in the past that had nothing to do with this virus, and I will again in the future. For about 15 minutes before I go live on Twitter and YouTube. Thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate it. Yeah, I finally get a URL. I really appreciate it, guys. All right. It's manufactured hysteria. Be on the lookout for a miraculous treatment soon. Well, we should be so lucky. This is not, I don't know what to tell you. Like I understand people's skepticism of the biomedical system in the United States, but, take it from me. I'm not getting paid by the government, by pharmaceutical companies, right? I am just a scientist. That's all I am. I have no ties to the private sector or even the government, any political institution. This is a real threat. And people in your life, if you know anybody who's over the age of 65, if you know anybody in your life that smokes, if you smoke, if you have any other malady, if you have diabetes, if you're obese, all of these things make you at a much higher risk of having a very, very severe life-altering infection by this coronavirus or potentially passing away. Just look at that stories coming out of Italy. I can tell you, I have friends that live in Italy, and they, have made it abundantly clear that what we have been reading about what has happened in Italy happened, and it's still happening. And I have a friend in France who's saying the same exact thing. And, they're not quite to the point of where Italy has been, but they're getting close. And frankly, unless people take this seriously, I don't see any reason why this wouldn't happen in the United States too. Come on, bro, you're paid to promote this fearmonger. I wish. I wish that somebody was paying me to talk about the risk of this virus. No, you should take this seriously. People in your life will be affected by this. There are plenty of epidemiologists, a virologist, or scientists focused on viruses, who have forecasted how many people in this country are going to inevitably be infected with this virus, and it is a massive percentage. And certainly some scientists are arguing that this pandemic is going to result in a virus that is endemic, meaning that this is just going to be part of the landscape of the viruses that we always are bombarded with. Right? There's a reason that we have seasonal flu, seasonal colds. In fact, like 20 to 25% of colds are caused by other coronaviruses. But it just so happens that no human has ever been exposed to this novel coronavirus that causes COVID-19 ever before in history. So you don't have any. So sometimes if you've been exposed to the flu or you got a flu vaccine, which you should get, your immune system might be able to respond a little bit more efficiently to a novel strain of the flu. But when it comes to this novel coronavirus, it's just not the case. Okay, the virus is just a way to bash Trump. I don't think so. I mean, think what you think about politics, political parties, but generally speaking, when the country is faced with a crisis, generally speaking, the country rallies around that leader. I mean, it's happened many times in the United States. So no, I mean, I think he will be judged on how this crisis is managed. Okay, thank you for stressing the importance. My brother is diabetic and smokes, and my parents are 82. Yeah, I mean, exactly. And it's, far fewer people in this country smoke than they used to, but it's not like nobody smokes. A lot of people smoke. And, that is just like one of the clear risk factors that coming out of the data that from China, people who smoke were at a higher risk. Oh my gosh, are you serious? We are going to have the privilege of speaking to a fellow McLaughlin, although not related as far as I'm aware. Beth Ann McLaughlin, where are you calling from and what's on your mind?
Hey, I am first-time caller, long-time listener. I'm a huge fan. I'm in Nashville, hunkered down in quarantine, and I just want to thank you so much. I can't possibly let you know how many folks are just getting very basic information wrong,
Yeah.
and not by for any reason other than the fact that there's so much confusing information out there. So I wish all the scientists who had your background would go and have these conversations with their neighbors, because even things like basic hygiene and what quarantine means. So can you talk about this, these small groups of folks where they're saying, okay, well, you can have 50 people in a room. Now you can have 10 people in a room. Because a lot of us are in a room stranded with teenagers.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so the idea is to limit, and I would love to hear so I should tell you folks that Beth Ann McLaughlin is a neuroscientist, and a far more accomplished neuroscientist than I am. But, as the concept here is to reduce the probability that somebody who's infected will be able to interact with another person who's infected, to then spread to other groups. And so with fewer people in a room, that probability goes down significantly. And I'm seeing now people talking about on the news, the whole goal is to flatten the curve, meaning that, to avoid us having a spike of people who are infected, basically bombarding our medical system, such that the hospitals won't be able to manage even just those patients who have been infected with this coronavirus. But then, our medical system is also just constantly dealing with a certain level of medical care. And so if you go to the hospital and you have the flu, right? You don't have the coronavirus, but you still need to be hospitalized for the flu. They might not be able to handle you. Or if you have a heart attack, and I only thought about this, like a couple days ago, shockingly, is that a lot of women are going to be scheduled to deliver a baby in the near future. And so, if people are reckless and they don't practice any social distancing, then, those women are not going to be able to receive the kind of care that I know from experience. My wife gave birth about a year ago. That you need. It's a lot of time by these, clinicians devoted to a pregnancy, a delivery. But anyway, that's, so the goal is not only to avoid spreading this coronavirus, but then other things as well, because of the prospect of such a giant load of patients coming in. So I mean, do you feel like I left anything out? Can you fill in any gaps? It looks like we might have some connect.
No, I think it's very important to have multiple voices, because some of us with teenagers are used to being ignored.
I'm looking forward to that. But anyway, so everybody, so Beth Ann McLaughlin is very, very active on Twitter, and you should check her out. And her handle is MCL Mickle, Neuro. And go check her out. She's been, active in changing the sort of the foundation of how scientists do science, socially, and so on. So everybody go check out Beth Ann McLaughlin. Thank you so much for calling in. It's really an honor to talk to you.
No, happy to thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And happy St. Patrick's Day. All right. That was really cool. I've never spoken to Mickle Neuro. You can see her handle there. I've never actually spoken to her. We've interacted for a while now, and she's a significant figure in neuroscience. I'll leave it at that. You are likely to believe he created the vaccine too. I certainly will not be creating a vaccine. That is not the kind of science I practice. I have teenagers who want to have their buddies over. Yeah, right. So now is not the time. It's rare that, at least from my perspective, it's rare that we have time like this devoted to being at home, with your family, or with the challenge of filling time that would normally be filled by, going out and interacting with people. Read a new book, learn a new skill, try to learn how to play the guitar or something. It's going to be a while. So I would suggest you exploit this time. But it is imperative that you don't treat this as a trivial concern. What about when Trump gutted the Center for Disease Control budget? So I'm not sure that that's quite accurate. But that the CDC itself was defunded. There was some rearranging that went on, and I'm not interested in talking about the politics of what's happening. What I'm interested in is talking about how we, people who are not in the CDC, not politicians, can do our part as Americans, right? We're all part of the same country, to stop the spread of this virus. Okay, why isn't this self-quarantining working? Much more cases every single day. Well, here's why, Matrixly. That is a very, very important point, actually. I'm glad you brought it up. So the reason is that, there wasn't a lot of testing that went on in the United States. There still isn't a lot that's going on. But, if by the way, if you're in Philadelphia, it turns out that on Monday, there will be a drive-through clinic that will be open for business, but only for people whose doctors have prescribed, a test, because we have limited numbers of tests. But so here's the story, right? Let's say in Philly today, we learned that there are 18 confirmed cases of the coronavirus. So that means that about, 2 weeks ago, right, that there was that many people who were exposed. And so that means that today, those 18 people interacted with, many, many other people and likely spread the virus. And so that's why you get this exponential increase in cases. Because we're always, every time we test, every time we get a number of confirmed cases, we know that we're several days at a minimum behind the actual spread of the virus. And so you won't know that this is working for another several weeks. There has, you don't even have to look back that far in the history of studying viruses, studying epidemics. You could just literally look at the evidence in South Korea and in China, who had, the response of their biomedical community is something that we could actually never do in the United States for some good reasons, by the way, right? China's an authoritarian state, and so they can just quarantine, lock down an entire city of millions of people, right? That's illegal to do in the United States, or at least it would be extraordinarily difficult to do. And I think, as Americans, we value personal liberty a little bit too much to allow that to happen. But it's just a different structure of government over there. And obviously, this is one of the advantages of that structure, which is they can just clamp down. But we know that because of that, the spread of this virus was limited tremendously. It's not like this concept of self-quarantining or social distancing is like a new idea that was just invented by Anthony Fauci at the CDC, right? This is a thing that you can do for essentially any infectious disease. And it's very, very simple. You don't have to have a PhD to do it, right? You can do your part. You can contribute to curing this or fighting this pandemic by just adjusting your daily life in a way that's not that radical. I mean, it's not like, you can never leave your house or anything like that is just being aware of what you're doing, being aware of hygiene, and being aware of how close you are to somebody. They say it's about 6 feet that you'd like to have between other people, and that's because literally, like, the physics of what happens when you sneeze or cough or potentially even breathe. There's evidence that it can be spread just from breathing, and I can talk about that evidence if you like. That, like, the effect of gravity on the physical viral particles as they're expelled from your mouth. They can't go much further than that. So just being aware of these basic things can help you to limit the spread. And if you care at all about people who are above the age of 65, who have any kind of any kind of malady, cancer, diabetes, if they're overweight, if they're immunocompromised for whatever reason, if you care at all about anybody like that you know, or people like that in general, your fellow Americans, then you should take this seriously. And by the way, what's the downside, right? It's not like you're paying, and by the way, people are trying to exploit Americans on this front, but it's not like you're paying for any specific product, right? You're not, paying for some kind of, elixir that'll cure this. Right? Unfortunately, there will be economic consequence. That's always the cost benefit that municipal, state, and federal government has to weigh. There will be economic consequences to this for sure. And it's been encouraging to see that in both chambers of the Congress, as well as the executive branch, the president, they've clearly prioritized a stimulus package of some kind. And so that's encouraging because, it is just inevitable. But the consequences of not doing this are far more dire. Just like people, we already know today, even if today we clamp down like China style, if we like quarantined everybody and so on, people will still die. People already have died from this coronavirus in the United States. And we know going forward, more people will die. The question is how many? And so we can limit that number by just doing some very simple things, like, social distancing at a minimum, staying home on St. Patrick's Day. That was the whole reason I jumped on, is that I hope that people are staying home for St. Patrick's Day rather than going out to bars. Science Peter, oh my gosh, it is a pleasure to see you in here, man. I hope all is well. And I appreciate it coming from Science Peter, who is a microbiologist. Okay. I predict a miraculous COVID treatment and historic economic recovery just in time for the 2020 election. It's possible. I mean, listen, I feel like there are certain things in life that are more important than politics. And this is one of them. Frankly, I think it is a baffling decision to have several primary elections, votes, throughout several different states, big states, with, by the way, a non-trivial number of people who are elderly that live there, like Florida. The notion that they're having this primary election tonight is just baffling to me. I mean, even if just purely cynical politics, like, you will be attached to what happens as a consequence of this. So anyways, but yeah, I mean, so one of the reasons that there's cause for some optimism for there potentially being a treatment in the not too distant future is that there are potential antiviral drugs that are already used to treat other maladies, other diseases, or just pancreatitis or cancer, that are already FDA approved, and we already know what they do when you give them to humans. That could potentially interfere with the ability of this novel coronavirus to infect cells. And if that turns out to be true, that will be a tremendous arrow in our quiver against this virus. But we're not there yet. I thought they should have postponed the primary. Absolutely. I mean, I don't understand the rationale of doing it. Yeah. Obama failed the H1N1 pandemic. I'm not quite sure why you're saying that. Actually, H1N1 was pretty effectively confronted. It was also more fatal than this. South Korea's rate is at 0.3, and they aren't authoritarian. They're not authoritarian, but they very, very rapidly responded with widespread testing. Part of the reason that so much data came out of South Korea is that they, like, far and beyond any other country, tested a huge number of people just randomly. Or not random, but just very, very widely. You didn't have to be prescribed a test. They had, that was their early response. And as a result, exactly where you are and what kind of response is necessary. So that was their strategy. I mean, that's something that we should theoretically be able to do. But we didn't respond quickly enough for that to have happened. All right. I predict the number of flu-related deaths will decrease by the same number of COVID-19 deaths. That also doesn't quite make sense. The flu is caused by the influenza virus. And by the way, I mean, the influenza virus, we have vaccines for it. We have biomedical science that's crafted towards effectively treating people who have the flu. And even despite all of that, a large number of people, thousands of people die from the flu. And, part of the reason that you want to practice social distancing, isolating or self-quarantining is that it's not like the flu left. It's not like the coronavirus and COVID-19 made an agreement with the flu that they're going to try this cycle. You take it off, flu. I'll take care of the infectious disease. It's still around. And so it's not only a matter of trying to avoid catching COVID-19 or catching this novel coronavirus, it's also trying to avoid other viruses, because what we're trying to do is limit the bombardment, the salvo of people who will show up at hospitals and literally occupy all of the beds that are available. That's the goal. That's the goal. You can get both. Exactly. You could catch the flu and then the next week develop COVID-19. These are totally different viruses. So this, however many fatalities are in the United States, in the world, will be on top of the number of people who have passed away from the flu. Okay. So let's see. Coronavirus has been around a long time. Well, that's true, Cheryl. You're absolutely right about that, but not this coronavirus. So coronaviruses are a family of viruses that share a lot of features, most notably what they look like. They have these spike proteins that cause the viral particles to be sort of spheroid with these little spikes that come out that look like a crown or corona. And you're absolutely, the figure I saw was about 20 to 25% of our seasonal colds are caused by coronaviruses. And of course, SARS, that outbreak was caused by a coronavirus. The lesser known, but also very dangerous, MERS was also caused by a coronavirus. And now this coronavirus, seems like we have one about every decade that emerges. But this is a new one, and nobody's been exposed to it before, of course, excluding the people who have been infected with it, recently. All right, need to find out if there's drive-through testing in Florida yet. I haven't heard of any, Brandy. Recently there was news that there will be drive-through testing in Philadelphia by the University of Pennsylvania, but only for people whose doctors have determined that they need to be tested. The goal being that we have a limited number of tests, which is just baffling to me that that's the case. I look forward to reading why that was even possible for this virus. But and so as a result, you don't want to just randomly be testing people, because you want to make sure that you identify people who have this novel coronavirus who are presenting symptoms. That's really the threshold. Okay. Let's see. Happy New Year. I'm from Wuhan. Is that right? Wow. This is on YouTube. Well, of course, I can't verify that, though your handle is in Mandarin. So I will take your word for it. I would love if you could, if you're from Wuhan, you could tell us what it's like over there. I would love to be able to read it. By the way, I am referring to somebody who's watching on YouTube. I'm only I just passed the threshold of subscribers for me to be able to actually have a URL on YouTube. But I've talked, a fair bit about this novel coronavirus, some of the basic biology in past streams. And you can find it by Ian Anthropoid Brain or something like that. All right. My nephew, wait, what happened? It seems like my chat is no longer updating on here. Okay, how many languages do you speak? I really only speak one. I learned Spanish when I was quite young, and I learned it in Miami and in Puerto Rico, and so you didn't pass the test unless you actually had the correct accent too, and so I can sound like I speak Spanish, but I actually don't really anymore. My daughter speaks Spanish though. She calls water agua. She's kind of cute. Did you work your lab close because of COVID-19? So I assume you're referring to, did my lab close because of COVID-19, or did we work with the coronavirus, which causes COVID-19? So no and no. Yeah. So it was a neuroscience lab. Right, this is a different strand. Exactly. Hey, Ian, should newborns be isolated from extended family, grandparents, uncles, etc.? So, again, the resources to which you should turn for these kinds of questions is the CDC in your local, your primary care physician or the newborn's pediatrician. I can tell you that, I mean, what's interesting is that a lot of social distancing resembles what a lot of people do instinctually when they're meeting a newborn for the first time. Like, very frequently, they don't want to be the one that holds the newborn because they don't want to be the one that got it sick. Because when a newborn gets sick, it is a dramatic affair. It is an automatic spinal tap. They just, that is like the first thing they do right when the baby comes in. And so, people typically try and refrain from holding it, or they just don't want to drop the baby, which is understandable. And so that is sort of like social distancing. But, I can tell you what I would do. Right? I have a 1-year-old. And yeah, we are pretty much on lockdown. I mean, we're not letting anybody, come in who doesn't absolutely need to come in. Every now and then we have a babysitter that helps us out when we both need to be working. And, we've discontinued that. And, because for us, it's just not worth it. And, I think pretty much any family member should be able to appreciate that, the risk to the newborn is pretty substantial. Now, that said, caring for a newborn is extremely challenging and really brutal. And so, if somebody maybe comes and stays with you, if that's possible, and just practices really good hygiene. But frankly, if I were in your shoes, I would not, I would forego their visits. All right. Does COVID-19 affect the brain? Yeah, it's an interesting question. So COVID-19 is caused by this novel coronavirus. That's the name for the disease. It's COVID-19. It's like coronavirus disease 19 because it came out in 2019. It came to theaters in 2019 in December. And so we're still learning a lot about the basic biology of this novel coronavirus, though a lot of research is happening much more rapidly than typically happens. And so we are learning quite a bit. And so I did see some papers that suggested that people with multiple sclerosis, there's evidence that coronaviruses interact with their brain in a unique way. But the reality is I just don't think, I haven't seen any studies, and I just don't think we're at the point with this particular coronavirus to know the specifics. But we do know, and this is kind of fairly recent science actually, that the immune system does interact with the brain. It used to be the sort of axiom, or the sort of accepted wisdom of the relationship between the brain and the peripheral immune system was that essentially the brain is one of the immunoprivileged parts of the body because of the blood-brain barrier, that B cells, T cells, natural killer cells, those types of those components of our immune system don't really ever gain entry into the brain. And so but it has recently been shown that that's not entirely the case, that there is an interaction between the immune system and the brain. There's also a relationship between psychiatric conditions, mood, chronic stress, anxiety, and so on, and the immune system. It can be immunosuppressive. So there's a relationship there. NYC, prepare to shelter in place. Yeah, things have changed very rapidly in New York City. It seems to affect the lungs most, right? Yeah, so it is a respiratory virus, much like the other coronaviruses. So like SARS, for example, was the coronavirus from the early aughts, was like severe acute respiratory syndrome. It's like a respiratory condition, and yeah, that does seem to be the case with this novel coronavirus. But that is quite likely the case based off of the biology of this virus, but it's not necessarily totally confirmed. And so I wouldn't take that to the bank quite yet. They're saying ibuprofen and Tylenol make things worse. So yeah, I mean, I saw that. What that came out of was a physician in France, I think, just tweeted this out, that it seems to be the case that ibuprofen specifically seems to render your immune system less effective in fighting it off. I've never seen actually any evidence of that. I haven't seen any research that proves it, but France is encountering a significant wave of this coronavirus, and I would defer, of course, to a physician in France. But I haven't necessarily seen that be proven scientifically or clinically. But it's worth noting that ibuprofen and Tylenol, which is acetaminophen, are different drugs. They accomplish similar goals, but acetaminophen is a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory, and ibuprofen is this non-steroidal anti-inflammatory, an NSAID, and acetaminophen is not. And so it could be, and actually that physician did recommend, they call it paracetamol in Europe. He recommended that you use that instead of ibuprofen. Click the thumbs up. Oh, thank you very much. You can call in. The number's on the screen. Yes, you can. Oh, you know what I realized? No. Yeah. Okay, it should work. Okay. Do you actually believe consciousness is formed by brain function? Do I actually believe that? Well, it doesn't matter what I believe, right? I as a scientist, I try and base, what I think about, what I think about the brain on evidence, on science, on data that has been peer reviewed by other scientists. And, what we, it's weird. So what we know about the relationship between consciousness and the brain is that if you damage any component of the brain, you will therefore damage some component of consciousness. No, it's not the coronavirus. So, for example, if you damage the occipital lobe, more posterior, more towards the back of the brain, which is where visual processing is conducted, you will damage visual components of consciousness. If you damage certain parts of the hippocampus, you will damage certain components of consciousness related to memory, short-term working memory, even spatial navigation. If you damage the frontal lobes, I mean, this is one of the classic stories in neuroscience that ties brain function to consciousness. If you damage part of the frontal lobe, you will have a dramatic change in personality and in behavior. And we know, I think if you talk about neuroscience, if you ever teach it, you're legally required to talk about Phineas Gage. And so at this point, it's rather boring to me. And I think a lot of people have heard about it. Basically, this was a guy who was working on a railroad, and because of how they worked on railroads at that time, he had an iron, one of those tamping rods, go right through the front of his skull. And in fact, you can actually see his skull. And you can actually see pictures of him now on the internet, which is remarkable because he lived. He survived that accident. And he moved on. And it turned out that soon after that injury, he became far more reckless. He never gambled, wasn't a drinker. He was not promiscuous, and he became all those things after that. I could go on and on. There are many instances of evidence that confirms the relationship between brain activity, certain parts of the brain, and consciousness. Don't they take out lions' hippocampus so they don't kill trainers? That's cute. Salt helps the body retain water instead of peeing it out. That's true. Grab a beer. It's St. Patty's. I actually do have a beer. I was debating whether I wanted to talk about it, or I wanted to have some. But given that we started talking about the coronavirus, I decided that it's probably best to not become inebriated in the slightest. Okay, having to stay inside and self-stimulate to prevent corona is messing with my brain. Yeah, I know. I mean, certainly for people who are used to being very, very social, oftentimes if you live in a city, and you're younger, you probably don't have a very big place. Your apartment or whatever is probably pretty small, not the most comfortable environment. And, people tend to be social. And so I can imagine that for some people, this is a more dramatic augmentation of their daily life. But it's absolutely worth it. Okay. Let's see. Oh, weird. It seems like comments are getting messed up. Sky is the smartest man on Scope. I can tell you, Dancing with Squares, that is not the case. I know for sure at least one person is smarter than I am, but I am very, very confident that I am no smarter than any of you guys. Nothing in my life has ever suggested to me that I'm any smarter than your average bear. I just happen to have the privilege of studying something that very few people are able to, and that's the brain. And so it's my job to know about the brain. But you get me talking about pretty much any other subject, and I'm useless. He said, one man. Oh, no, it's Deanna Hooper. I'm talking about a female cosmologist. What do you think about antidepressant sedatives like Xanax and soul relationship? Well, I mean, we have a question on YouTube. Well, I can tell you, and then Emily will talk about yours about orgasm. It's an interesting topic. So I'm no expert in theology. Spirituality. That's just not what I've studied. As I just said, I've studied the brain. And I do kind of approach neuroscience from the perspective of a neuropharmacologist. And so pharmacology refers to the action of drugs. Neuropharmacology refers to the action of drugs in the brain. And so antidepressants, are pharmacological. What they do is they elevate the amount of time that serotonin hangs out in a synapse. Xanax, on the other hand, is a benzodiazepine that inhibits that essentially activates, renders more sensitive GABA receptors, so that when GABA binds to receptors, it induces a greater effect than it would otherwise when Xanax or Klonopin, alprazolam or clonazepam bind the receptor. And so, so the relationship between these drugs and your consciousness is a direct one. The whole point of taking an antidepressant, after all, is to modulate mood. Thank you so much for the super heart. I appreciate it, Loham. And Sherry, I believe. Thank you so much for the super hearts, everybody. So that is an intended relationship, the relationship between antidepressants and consciousness. But how you define soul is really up to you. I mean, as a neuroscientist, I don't have any business defining what a soul is for you. I can tell you, I could give you a sort of framework for one way to think about the soul, but yeah, it's not necessarily useful to you. Thank you for this discussion. It's my pleasure. Very long history of bronchitis since childhood. Wow, couldn't take anything for it. Oh man, I'm sorry to hear that. There's someone back here. Thank you so much, Curb. I appreciate it. But I assure you, I am no smarter than you. I on it, like, it may sound to you like I'm being like, this is false modesty or something, but it's not. Like, I certainly am not the smartest person when I was in grad school. And I just know, like, just people are smarter than they think. It's just if you devote like almost a decade to one subject every day, that's what you do, that's what you think about, you should get pretty good at that subject, right? I seriously heard that about lions. Oh, I guess I'm not sure what you're referring to then. All right, well, it looks like the person on YouTube that wanted to talk about orgasms deleted their comment. So so I assume that they actually don't want to talk about orgasms. Clonazepam, by the way, is like forbidden to give by doctors for some reasons. So Jeremiah, I think you're referring to clonazepam, which is called, Klonopin is probably the name most people are familiar with. So benzodiazepines used to be prescribed. It's a benzodiazepine in the same family as like Valium, diazepam, or lorazepam, or alprazolam, which is Xanax. That family of drugs used to be prescribed really, really regularly. About a decade ago, and this was sort of, it used to be essentially considered one potential treatment for depression and anxiety, but no longer. And then they were also oftentimes used to treat sleep issues. Now we know a lot more about the pharmacology of these drugs, and people develop a chemical dependency at a minimum very rapidly with benzodiazepines, and also potentially addiction. And unfortunately, the withdrawal from benzodiazepines is actually fairly life-threatening, potentially, depending upon how much you've taken. And so as a result, they're really only reserved now. Oh, and then I should also say that it turns out that, as we've had this opioid addiction epidemic in the United States for several years now, and it turns out that after that sort of rise in opioid addiction, there was a smaller but definitely non-trivial rise in benzodiazepine addiction and at least dependence. And part of that is because they were too widely prescribed, but also part of it is that for some people, they are moderately rewarding. And so people do sometimes use them recreationally. And there's a whole gray market of benzodiazepines, meaning like benzodiazepines that you can buy on the internet. It's not like Xanax or Klonopin, but it's like atizolam, or these sort of analogs of other benzodiazepines that deliver many of the same effects, and they have become rather popular as well. And so as a result, there is a sort of an interest by the medical community to reduce just how widely they're prescribed. But benzodiazepines are very useful medications. For example, when somebody has a seizure, a benzodiazepine is like one of the frontline treatments to stop the seizure. And for an anxiety attack, they're very, very effective. It just, the cost benefits are there's greater costs to benzodiazepines than was initially appreciated. My son has benzo addiction. I'm sorry to hear that. Oh, we lost him to overdoses from benzos. Oh, geez, I'm so sorry to hear that. Yeah, another issue is that benzodiazepines, people, you can overdose on a benzodiazepine, of course. That's true for essentially any drug. But particularly when combined with other drugs that are used recreationally, namely alcohol and opioids, there is an effect. The effects that they induce in combination are greater than the sum of their parts. Meaning, let's say you take a certain dose of benzodiazepine, it can be quite high, and you have the effects, but then you don't overdose. It's not fatal. And then different day, you take a certain dose of alcohol. You have let's say 5 drinks. Right? It's a lot of alcohol for most people. You'll get pretty drunk, but it's not going to be life-threatening for most people. However, if you take both those doses at the same time, that could potentially be life-threatening, because they're synergistic, essentially. They potentiate each other's effect. That's also true for opioids. Opioids, of course, again, you can overdose from an opioid, but the difference here is that opioids suppress respiration, right? They make it harder for you to breathe. And most of the time that's not a problem, but if you have benzodiazepine as well, that amplifies that effect. Okay, what are the most exciting developments in migraine science? Oh, sure, Jordan Lamb on YouTube brings up. By the way, I have a YouTube channel, and you can find it by typing in like Ian Anthropoid Brain, although I just passed 100 subscribers, so soon I'll just be able to say my YouTube channel, the name. But if you're interested, I talk about specific topics for about 15 to 20 minutes before I go live here on Sundays. And so just type in Ian Anthropoid Brain. I've talked about the coronavirus a fair bit. Talked about a new treatment for migraine, I believe. So migraines. One interesting development has been in identifying a biochemical pathway that seems to be involved in at least a substantial percentage of people who suffer from migraines. And it's sort of complicated biochemistry, but basically it results in the overproduction of reactive oxygen species, and that is then registered as inflammatory pain by your pain system. And so there's a drug called Aimovig that directly interferes with that interaction, and it has been shown to reduce migraines in people 50% of the time for 50% of people with migraines, which is fabulous. There is also the fairly recent innovation of using Botox. Yes, that Botox, for treating migraine. And it seems to be quite effective for some people for whom other migraine medications are ineffective. The frontline treatment for migraine, of course, is the triptan drugs, which are serotonergic, meaning they bind serotonin receptors. But they're only effective for a certain cohort of people with migraines. For some, they're completely ineffective. So I would imagine, so Aimovig is actually an antibody, which is kind of wild, but there just aren't that many antibody treatments for headaches. And so I would imagine that a similar medicinal chemistry strategy can be used to target other pathways that may be more or less active in other people with migraines. I saw somebody was calling in. Feel free to call back in. I just wanted to respond to that question because they had asked it a while ago on YouTube. How much do you make if you don't mind me asking? I don't mind you asking. Nothing at the moment. So I finished my PhD in neuroscience in December, this last December. And what I can tell you is that one of the many things that distinguishes getting a PhD in biomedical science from getting, a PhD in humanities, like, English literature or sociology or something like that, is, first of all, generally speaking, most PhDs are compensated during graduate school. But in the STEM fields, you're actually compensated comparatively quite well. So, at Penn, different schools, different institutions have slightly different what they call stipends, basically a yearly salary. At Penn, it was about $31,000, I think, a year. It changed over time. Oh, thank you so much, Carrie. I appreciate the super hearts. That's very generous of you. I really appreciate it. But then you also get benefits, right? You get pretty good health insurance, generally speaking. But then, and then afterwards, of course, your job is to go find a job. And you can go into the private sector to, go to work in the pharmaceutical industry or biotech or something and get compensated really quite well. Or you can try and obtain a professorship, try and stay in academia, and you get, you get a pretty generous income. It's not substantial. It's not nearly as much as you would in the private sector, but you get covered. But it's also very, very difficult these days to become a professor. That's because there's not that many professorships that have been created commensurate with the number of new PhDs. Or you can go into other industries as well. And so, I'm still navigating that world. You're truly a hero. Thanks a lot. Many psychologists give and get off, but I believe I am gonna. I appreciate it, but I assure you I am not a hero. Is Tony Robbins a crackpot? Well, I mean, he's clearly made a difference in a lot of people's lives. So Tony Robbins are referring to, I think he calls himself a self-help coach, or I think he takes on that moniker of self-help willingly. I haven't consumed a lot of Tony Robbins' writing or videos and stuff like that, but from what I've seen, there is some benefit, in sort of basing your confidence on something valid and substantive and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, there's certainly a lot of BS in that industry, and also that's fine. If something helps another person in their life and it doesn't harm people, I'm fine with it. I don't really care. But if they base stuff on pseudoscience or miscommunicated science or just wrong information that has some relationship with science, that's where I have a problem. And I think the most overt offender here, and this is surprising because he has an MD, is Deepak Chopra. He's constantly now talking about, or at least he was a couple of years ago, talking about quantum mechanics and the relationship between quantum mechanics and consciousness, and it was just all nonsense. And in fact, you don't have to take my word for it. You can, there's videos of Deepak Chopra either in debates. At the time, he would debate Christopher Hitchens quite regularly, which is very fun. Regardless of what you think of Christopher Hitchens, he was a good speaker. But at one point they have a debate at, I think, Caltech. Caltech, if you don't know, is like one of the, it's sort of like, you might know of MIT. Caltech is like MIT, but on the West Coast. It is a significantly well-regarded scientific institution. And so he's talking about quantum mechanics to a room full of Caltech physicists, and they just laugh at him. I mean, they literally laughed at him. Okay, appreciate the response and the distilling of your knowledge. It's my pleasure. Thanks for joining, Jordan Lamb, on YouTube. You can find my YouTube channel. I talk about specific topics for about 15 to 20 minutes before I go live. You can find my YouTube channel by typing in like Ian Anthropoid Brain, and you'll probably be able to find it. Christopher Hitchens was brutally smart as a whip. I agree. Yeah. What is your next step? Just had a baby, right? Yes. Just had a baby. She is doing well and growing. It's shocking how like it seems like every day she develops a new power. Oh my God. Yeah. It's so cute during dinner tonight. But in any case, I'm still trying to figure that. I'm applying to different jobs. I'm really, what I would love to do, and this may be possible because I've applied for one specific position that would be wonderful. What I would like to do is work at the interface between science and government policy, in particular with regards to the opioid addiction epidemic, because what the government is doing, what many, and this is excluding certain municipalities that are taking some interesting approaches to addiction. What the federal government is doing is not only not ineffective, it is counterproductive. It actually is exacerbating the problem. And I really think, of course, everybody has political beliefs and everything, but I really do think that this is one of the issues that is totally bipartisan. People really do want to solve this problem. It's not like only Democrats or only Republicans or independents, or libertarians or whatever. It's not like only they develop addictions, right? Opioid addiction afflicts everybody regardless of your political beliefs. And I really do think there is authentic, genuine interest on both sides of the aisle to solve this problem. And so I think it's just an issue where the people making these decisions just aren't exposed to the research, the public health research, to more effectively solve this problem. Had the virus affected your surgery? Oh, wait. No, I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. Had the virus affected your surgery? I'm not sure what you mean. Well, thank you, Iwaki. Quantum tunneling. Is quantum tunneling cheating? That's cute. That is so awesome. We need that so much in our communities. Well, I'm glad that I'm not quite sure to what you're referring, but it sounds positive. Is there a link between severe anxiety, agoraphobia, treatment resistant after recovery of a 13-year opioid addiction? Absolutely. So, opioids it's one of the like, there's almost like a paradox. It's not quite a paradox, but it's one of the central challenges of treating chronic pain, which is that treating pain is that one of the systems in our body that regulates pain is the opioid system. And in particular, the mu-opioid receptor, which happens to be the receptor from which, or to which, morphine, oxycodone, fentanyl bind. Unfortunately, that signaling system also regulates mood. And it regulates aspects of mood that are like, I think one could argue, like more primitive and like primal. It's like, like, so for example, cocaine, it activates a circuit in the brain that is really devoted to the expectation of reward. It's like the feeling you get right as you're placing a bet that you think you're going to win, that excitement, that it feels good, it feels like you're alive. That's what cocaine activates. It's an important part of the brain, and it is very, very addictive, don't get me wrong. But opioids, they influence mood signaling in a way that's closer to like the gratification of a mother breastfeeding, right? It's like some of the deepest, most powerful emotional states. And that's part of the reason for why opioids are so addictive, but also that's part of the reason for why the withdrawal from opioids is so severe. And one of the opioids are anxiolytic. They do reduce anxiety pretty effectively. And in fact, there have been studies evaluating the potential use of synthetic opioids like tramadol to treat depression and anxiety. This is not a widely held goal, I should say, but there have been studies. And that's in part because tramadol also induces the release of monoamines like serotonin. But in any case, but essentially, when it comes to neuropharmacology, you can essentially predict what the withdrawal symptoms are going to be by the effects that the drug induces. Meaning, opioids reduce anxiety, they reduce pain, they're analgesic. And then during withdrawal, after chronic use, the pendulum swings in the opposite direction, right? You are reducing anxiety, you're reducing pain, you're increasing euphoria, and then you let the pendulum go during withdrawal, and it swings in the opposite direction on all those fronts. And so as a result, you get exacerbated anxiety, you get hyperalgesia, meaning you're actually more sensitive to pain. And that, by the way, is part of the reason for why people who are taking opioids for like back pain, chronic pain, when they try and wean off opioids, it tends to be the case that even if the injury or whatever it was that was causing the pain to begin with is completely healed, that you can still experience pain, psychosomatic pain during withdrawal. And so, yeah, that is not unusual. Depending upon of course, it could be the case, and this is the case for a lot of psychiatric conditions, people take these drugs to self-medicate, right? As a kind of, and there's a reason, like these drugs do very effectively increase mood and reduce aversive mood, right? That's why they're so popular, but unfortunately they're not sustainable. And the way that they attack, depression or anxiety is such that once you stop taking the medication, all of those issues are exacerbated. But, as a result, people, oftentimes addiction is depression masquerading as addiction, or social anxiety masquerading as addiction. And so, that is not unusual. My point being that there may be some underlying anxiety-associated condition that was part of your motivation to take opioids chronically, that then warrants treatment, right? So government agencies need to understand what works in treating the opioid crisis and what does not. I couldn't agree more. You said it better than I could. Okay, we give tramadol when my pup is having arthritis pain. Yeah, it actually is used in veterinary medicine, but not exclusively. That's true for ketamine, for example. People call ketamine a horse tranquilizer or a cat tranquilizer. It is those things, but it's also a human tranquilizer. Like, it's not like some drugs are only effective. Some drugs that are effective in animals are not going to be effective in humans, at least psychoactive drugs. Can certain disorders have a chromosome transplant, or can chromosomes be cloned if they are damaged? Super interesting topic. So yes, there are definitely disorders and diseases that emerge from translocated sections of chromosomes. And there's a bunch. They tend to be rather severe. Because, if you're translocating an entire segment of a chromosome, that is hundreds of genes that are being moved and not being expressed at the right time in the right place. And so that definitely happens. Now, what you're referring to is potentially a genetic medicine, right? So treatment to specifically target genetic, malfunction. or dysfunction. And so, yes, theoretically, that is possible through the introduction of a technology like CRISPR-Cas9. So CRISPR-Cas9, it's a weird name for basically a technology that enables us to go in very precisely and edit only what we want to edit within the genome, within a sequence of genes. And we used to be able, before CRISPR-Cas9, we could alter genetics, but it was far less precise than CRISPR is. The difficulty, though, with like targeting genes on the scale that you're describing is that a whole section of a chromosome is a ton of genes. And genetics just hasn't advanced to the point where we can manipulate that many genes with being able to predict or anticipate the results. I mean, there's still a lot of concern of just editing one gene. And so yeah, but theoretically, absolutely it's possible. The only cure for addiction is another addiction. You know, I understand what you're saying there, but addiction is something specific. So I would rephrase what you're saying as one of the cures, to be fair, one of the cures for addiction is substituting it for another chemical dependence, right? Chemical dependence and addiction are not the same thing. In fact, you don't even need a chemical dependence to develop some addictions, some would argue. I'm a little bit iffier on that, but a chemical dependence means that one has taken a drug regularly and at doses sufficient to induce tolerance and a withdrawal. In other words, the drug has altered their biology such that once you take the drug out of the equation, out of their body will respond to the absence of that drug, generally speaking, unfavorably. Addiction is most frequently that, but on top of that is that the use of the drug occurs in the face of known negative consequences, meaning that there will be negative consequences for you continuing to drink or buying heroin, doing heroin, or buying meth. You're not able to pay your rent. Your loved ones, you're affecting your loved ones in a negative way. Your partner might leave you, or you're an absent parent, but you still engage in the use of that drug. That's addiction, and that's different from just chemical dependence. So are blocks of genes cuttable, or do you have to cut one at a time? Oh, interesting topic. My first reaction is you could theoretically do a whole chunk at a time, but that's probably not how it would be done. But yeah, theoretically you could. Yeah, I mean, so the reason I'm responding in this way, that I'm like sort of clearly dancing around this topic a little bit as I'm dancing with the topic in my mind as I'm speaking, right? Is that when we, for example, make viruses, in my lab we make viruses, and you can think of a virus as like a ruler, right? And that every number is a different gene, and every gene is just a sequence of nucleotides, A, T, C's, and G's. Or if it's an RNA virus like this novel coronavirus, A, U, G's, and C's. Anyways, that is inconsequential. But so what that means is that if you know let's say you're interested in editing this gene right here, and you know the sequences of nucleotides here and here. Well, we can make enzymes that will recognize those flanking sequences, cut at those points, thereby removing this sequence, and then you can put in whatever you want in place of that. And so, you can edit just very subtle collections of nucleotides, just like, a couple nucleotides, or you can edit several genes. And so the reason we do that in neuroscience to make viruses is that then we can make a virus that does precisely what we want it to do. It causes neurons to generate green fluorescent protein. Or what I did in my research is that we used a virus that caused neurons to manufacture a receptor, just like a neurotransmitter receptor, or like a receptor that a drug would bind, like cocaine or amphetamine. But this receptor only binds a drug that I have that doesn't bind anything else in the body. And so it's sort of like my own little pet receptor within any neuron that was infected with the virus. But you can make viruses do other things as well. So my reservation is that, that many genes on a chromosome, I don't know that you could effectively ensure that the corrected or the altered sequences would insert in the right way. I don't know. I'd have to think about that for a while. Yeah. Okay, what time? Oh, it's 9:30. Okay, I should call it a night. Well, happy St. Patrick's Day. I didn't get to drink my beer, unfortunately. I'm kind of looking forward to it. It's a collaboration between Stouts, I think that's how you pronounce it, and Sly Fox, both great breweries. But I hope. Oh, what's up from State College, PA? Hey, what's up from Philly? I was in State College last year. It's a very beautiful area. It's totally different than I expected. State College is where Penn State is, for anybody that's not familiar. And it took me an embarrassingly long time for me to realize that that's actually the name of the place. Anyways, yeah. Yeah, so happy St. Patrick's Day. One last time, I have a YouTube channel. It looks like I passed this 100 people subscriber threshold, but I would still appreciate it if you're interested. I do about 15 to 20 minutes on a very specific topic, deeper dive, before I go live on both Twitter and then YouTube. So you can check that out. I've talked a fair bit about this novel coronavirus, as well as some potential, the prospects of some new treatments for it. So type in like Ian, anthropoid brain. And I also have a podcast called Wired to be Weird. I talk about specific topics for much longer than 15 to 20 minutes. Things like, what are dreams? Why do we have dreams? How does cannabis work? How does, weed, THC, what does it do in the brain? What is addiction? Is addiction a disease or a disorder? Alzheimer's, dementia. I talk about a lot of different topics on that podcast called Wired to be Weird. And I have a Patreon. And if you're in a position to throw me some support, for example, my microphone stand just broke, so I'm going to need to get a new one. Patreon.com/anthropoid. And I only use funds from that income, as well as the Super Hearts, by the way, for the purchase of those types of equipment to more effectively convey topics in biomedical science. So patreon.com/anthropoid. If you're able to contribute, I would appreciate it. Otherwise, happy St. Patty's Day. Enjoy, be safe, stay inside, practice social distancing, be a responsible member of society, a responsible member of the human species. And I hope to see you again sometime this week while we're all social distancing, or if not, for sure, on Sunday at around 4:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And until then, have a great week. Have a great night. All right, YouTube, this is the very awkward time where I am still live on YouTube, but nice, huh? Yeah. And I have to stop that this way. All right, thank you guys so much for subscribing. I super appreciate it. I didn't expect that to happen today, so that's really good. It's a wonderful St. Patrick's Day miracle, so I appreciate it. Stay safe, everybody. Have fun. I'll talk to you next time.